Welcome to the Great Basin Seasonal Outlook for July through October. Over the last 30 days, we've seen much cooler temperatures across most of the Great Basin, along with wetter conditions, especially over the northern half of the Great Basin, with nearly daily showers and thunderstorms for the last few weeks. We also did have a couple of days where we saw some showers and thunderstorms produce some good rainfall down over far southern areas of the Great Basin, but this really only lasted a couple of days. The more consistent moisture with showers and thunderstorms has been over the northern half of the Great Basin, with many areas above normal for the time of year for precipitation. Since the beginning of the water year, again, this recent moisture continues to add to the moisture we saw in the winter and spring, so we are seeing near to above normal precipitation in most areas, taking all months into account for. The only exceptions are parts of central and southern Idaho and also parts of south central Nevada, which did not fare quite as well and have seen generally below normal precipitation. But again, the recent moisture we've seen up in Idaho has kept things relatively quiet and has at least kept the fuel moistures a little bit higher. Looking at some of the precipitation we saw last monsoon season, so from last July in 2022 through October, again, a very good monsoon, dropping precipitation well above normal for California, Nevada especially, but also into parts of Arizona and the southern half of Utah. Further north, that moisture really didn't make its way much up into southern and central Idaho, so definitely not as much precipitation there. So if we combine the monsoon and the winter precipitation, at least through the end of April, you can see obviously most areas did fairly well, again with some drier spots through the Great Basin. We did have some fine fuel carryover, which is where we've been seeing some of our fires that have grown to a few hundred acres or even a few thousand acres, especially up north in the lower elevations of southern Idaho. This has mainly been in the dead carryover grasses, as the new growth with the recent moisture and cooler temperatures really hasn't dried out enough, or the sagebrush hasn't dried out enough either to really be contributing to fire spread. So again, the dead carryover has been the main player up in southern Idaho. We also have some of this carryover down into far northwest Nevada, but not quite as much as what we saw into southern Idaho. Further south into western and south central Nevada and anything in Utah really was compacted by any of the winter snowfall we saw that was on the ground for extended periods of time. Looking at our live fuel moistures now as the end of June, we have seen a peak to the sagebrush moistures, and they are all trending downward. Still across the Great Basin, whether you're in the north, central, or even far south, the live fuel moistures for sagebrush are still near or above normal for the time of year. These areas in Idaho and far western Nevada, or actually northern California, just on the far west side of the basin, are where the live fuel moistures are actually the lowest, and those are generally just near normal. But we will see hotter and drier conditions going into July, so we do expect these fuel moistures to change almost daily. If not, certainly over a couple of weeks, we'll see significant drying to all of our fuel types. Looking at the 10-hour fuel moisture, the lowest 10-hour fuel moisture is where the conditions have been driest the longest, from Arizona up into southern Utah and southeast Nevada. And a similar trend in the 100-hour and in the 1,000-hour as well. Looking at our soil moisture anomaly, soil moistures are well above normal over the northern half of the Great Basin, with the winter precipitation, and we're still dealing with the snowmelt. Even with the cooler temperatures, we're getting additional snowmelt to just continue due to the time of year. And also the wetter conditions we've seen over the last month are contributing to this well above normal soil moisture, along with contributing to the snowmelt. So we are still looking at some flood concerns going forward, or at least rises on area creeks, rivers, and streams due to the continued snowmelt and the continued shower activity. However, this is coming to an end, so we'll likely see any of those flood concerns start to subside as we move through the month of July. Looking at our drought monitor, we've seen drought significantly improve. We still have areas of drought over southern Utah and over southern Nevada. Again, this did improve quite a bit, but with the recent drying we've seen over the last month or so, this drought likely will remain. It could intensify depending on the monsoon, but right now it will at least persist in these areas, with really no drought further north into the rest of the Great Basin, and that likely won't change anytime soon. The only difference will be up into western Wyoming, where we are still holding on to some short and long-term drought. We'll likely see improvements going through the next couple of months to that drought. So looking at how the drought has changed from late June in 2022 on the left to late June in 2023 on the right, again, you can see the significant improvements we've made. We've seen the drought category improve 2 to 3 levels over the last 12 months, or really across the Great Basin. And this is good news, certainly for the water supply, good news for our higher elevations, for sure, with the snowpack we saw and the higher fuel moistures. So things will be relatively quiet in the higher elevations for some time yet. However, looking at the lower elevations, where we tend to burn the most acres, are in years that we are coming out of drought or having no drought at all. And this is mainly due to the moisture, which also obviously aids in the growth of fine fuels, and we are seeing significant fine fuel growth across the Great Basin this year. We haven't seen many fires aside from smaller initial attack fires, with the exception of what we've seen in the carryover up in southern Idaho yet. However, grasses with the recent moisture are still in various states of curing and are certainly not cured out across much of the Great Basin yet. That will change in the coming weeks, so we do anticipate an increase in our fire activity and our large fire potential going through the month of July, especially across the northern half of the Great Basin. For Utah, we see similarities with the drought and with our fire seasons. So again, seeing bigger fire seasons where we burn more acres in years that we either don't have drought or we're entering or exiting drought, again, due to the fine fuel growth. And then Idaho, still similar situation as well. The one thing we don't see when we are in years of no drought or exiting drought is typically big, higher elevation fires across much of the Great Basin. That might be a little different for central Idaho later in the fire season, since they didn't get quite as much snowfall and do still have some areas of drought just north. So we certainly could see an uptick in the higher elevations in central Idaho, especially as we get late in the fire season, more towards August. But elsewhere across the Great Basin, probably be a minimal concern at this time. So putting everything together, we will look at some of our longer trends, La Nina, El Nino. We have been in a multi 2 to 3 year La Nina, which we are exiting at the present time. And looking at all of these forecast models, which is each of these individual lines, you can see the sea surface temperature trend in the forecast is upward. So we will see warming, which pushes us more into the potential of El Nino. So we're definitely anticipating that throughout the fire season and then going through the rest of the year, potentially into early 2024. So again, that's a big shift from what we've seen the last few years, and that is certainly contributing to our weather pattern this summer, with these West Coast troughs continuing to provide periods of showers and thunderstorms and really delay the monsoon. So speaking of the monsoon, looking at the 8 to 14 day outlook, typically we would have already seen the monsoon develop in late June and early July, pushing into the Great Basin. However, that is not the case this year. These West Coast troughs, again, have prevented that Four Corners high from really developing, so we have not yet seen the light of the monsoon yet. And looking through at least the next couple of weeks into the early half of July, we're still looking at below normal precipitation and above normal temperatures. There are some hints in the models of seeing the Four Corners high develop maybe towards mid-July, so we could see the monsoon start to develop the latter 2 weeks of July. That remains to be seen at this time. Right now, we are still expecting, obviously we have been expecting the monsoon to be delayed, which clearly it is, but we are also anticipating when it does start that it will be on the weaker side. So we'll see how that materializes going through the next 2 months. So here is our July through October Predictive Services temperature and precipitation outlook. First, focusing on temperatures, the top row. Again, we've seen the cooler temperatures recently, but that will be changing as we go through July with more near normal or even some above normal temperatures, which are typically hot. This is one of our hottest months for sure. And we will start July with temperatures 5 to 10 degrees or more above normal for the Great Basin. So are expecting some hot temperatures heading into the beginning of July. As we move through August, September, and October, we're looking at more of an above normal temperature trend. Precipitation, however, we've seen wetter conditions over the northern half of the Great Basin much of May into June, and that looks like the potential will continue for July, August, even part of September, depending on the weather pattern. Now, that being said, we will have some periods of hotter and drier conditions, which is, again, looking like it will be the first half of July. But we still do expect the wetter pattern to return at some point throughout the fire season, or at least have periods of wetter conditions alternating with those drier hot periods. Looking at the southwest with the precipitation, we are looking at below normal for July and August. So again, that is showing that when the monsoon does develop, we are still expecting it to be on the weaker side. So that brings some concerns for our fire season for southern areas of the Great Basin that would typically be getting more moisture in July and August, and quieting down fire season in a normal year might not really be occurring this year. As we move into September, we still have some lingering moisture for the Great Basin, maybe not so much up into Idaho. So as we get into later in August and September, that could keep things active up in Idaho a little bit longer in the season. So we'll just keep monitoring that as we get a little bit closer. Confidence isn't super high in how long this season will go when it finally starts. And then once we move towards October, it looks like the moisture will be pushed off to the east and we might be looking at a drier fall. So putting everything together, here is our Predictive Services outlook for the next 4 months. So for July, again, with the delayed monsoon or even a weaker monsoon when it does start the latter half of the month, we are indicating above normal fire potential for those southern areas that, again, would typically be getting wetter conditions. And if we're not getting wetter conditions, they've been pretty dry recently, so we do expect an uptick in fire activity at a time in the year when things would typically be starting to wind down. This may continue into August, but right now there's still a lot of uncertainty going into later in the month how much moisture we'll get. So we could have some areas of above normal in the south in August, but again, we're kind of holding off right now. We did continue with our above normal for August and extended it into September for northwest Nevada into southern Idaho. Again, it is obviously a delay for the curing of the fuels up there, but once they do cure out throughout the month of July, we are anticipating a drying trend to at least materialize sometime either later in August or even early August, depending on the pattern, and then continue into September. So that could increase the likelihood of especially grass fires. And if we continue with dry conditions going into September, that's really when we see our early cold fronts with increased wind. So again, that's our main area of concern later in the fire season. Those areas of above normal could certainly expand depending on the fuel situation, how critical things get, and then where that monsoon moisture, when it does develop, where it actually pushes into. So we are, again, monitoring expanding that as well. By October, we're looking for normal conditions at the present time, and we'll continue to watch that depending on the weather pattern. That concludes our seasonal outlook for this month. Check back on August 1st for the latest updates.